Good morning. I've been looking at the wiki some more. So I made a list of kind of all of the arguments I've seen for the most part. I think maybe there are a few that didn't make this list, but um, I'll add them later if that's the case. First argument on the pro is deterrence. This is straightforward. I think the best response to deterrence is that there's a double bind where either Putin is easily deterred, in which case it seems like it is very likely that alternative forms of deterrence will solve, or Putin is not easily deterred, in which case it is very easy to say that this policy is unlikely to deter him for a lot of different reasons. There's some nuances to deterrence. There's an argument about deterring Putin from attacking Ukraine. I think most obviously, the European nuclear deterrent will not extend to Ukraine. Ukraine will not be getting any nukes. At best, a Ukrainian neighbor, Poland, will get nukes, but I'm not sure that that's sufficient to deter ongoing conflict in Ukraine. I don't think, for example, that Russia will pull back from Ukraine, especially given that there are enormous costs to Putin to doing so. And I don't know that this will like deter continued infractions against Ukraine that happen outside of the jurisdiction of the EU. Second nuance is this idea that strategic ambiguity is bad, and we should be very clear about our commitments to deter Russia from the rest of Europe. Number one is that this ambiguity is already kind of being clarified, and obviously can be very easily clarified without a nuclear sharing agreement. For instance, the UK and France agreement already sort of clarified this by saying that they couldn't imagine a threat to the European vital interests that wouldn't threaten their own vital interests as well, thereby saying that they would extend their nuclear deterrent in sort of a symbolic fashion over the rest of Europe. But also, I think that this misunderstands the resolution a little bit because there's nothing about the resolution that inherently gives up ambiguity or reduces ambiguity. So I don't know that there's actually a link here because it's possible, it's actually likely that the doctrine of strategic ambiguity from France continues the same exact way with nuclear sharing. And then finally, there's an undersea cables argument about sort of naval deterrence. I think the easiest response here is that there's nothing really about a French nuclear sharing agreement that will specifically deter like cable cutting uniquely. There's a link about submarines, but submarines are usually not involved in nuclear sharing. It's usually air nukes. And also, I think that the whole point of undersea cable cutting is that it's a gray zone escalation that exists below the threshold of nuclear retaliation. Like, no one's going to nuke you for cutting a cable, especially because it's very difficult to determine with any proof that you actually did it, and that it was you. So I think this is actually likely to be of retaliation instead of something that can be easily deterred by nuclear weapons. Next argument on the pro is prolif. So most obvious candidate for prolif in the status quo is Poland. Maybe the argument is that this reassures them. I think the easiest response here is that Poland is unlikely to go for nuclear weapons. And again, there's a similar double bind as to the deterrence argument earlier, where if they really do want nuclear weapons, they probably want them because they want absolute control over nuclear weapons. So it's unlikely that a French nuclear sharing agreement, especially the watered down version that it's likely to look like, will actually solve. And there's like a time frame lag as well. And then there's some different impacts from Polish proliferation that are interesting and worth looking into. The next pro argument is freeing up the US. This is kind of like a US withdrawal good, but a bit more nuanced. You could read it without conceding to US withdrawal being a thing that actually happens. And the scenario that I've seen it read most with is this Indo-Pacific reassurance argument that like this will prevent, for example, South Korean or Japanese prolif, because we can focus more on the Indo-Pacific. This is an interesting argument. I think the best response is just that this is bad, right? That like it is bad for the US to focus more on the Indo-Pacific at the expense of Europe, which seems to be the tacit assumption of this argument, and that this might give up some of the deterrent capability. I think the other good response is that if the US does leave Europe at all, allies in the Indo-Pacific are also likely to see that it is a fickle friend, that it's not a very good ally, and that its security commitments are not very effective. And so that might be a more likely scenario. The next argument on the pro is the EU cohesion argument that maybe like the EU will fall apart unless it stays cohesive with greater strategic autonomy. I think this is an interesting argument where like we're using phrases to sort of replace actual arguments to some extent. And actually, I think this is something that I could rant about for all of the arguments and for sort of the state of debate itself right now. There's a bit of a simulacra at play, I think, where like the symbols of arguments, like ambiguity, are starting to replace the actual argument that they originally were meant to explain. So like it's such that you could just say the phrases instead of explaining the original argument, and that can become the argument in the round. I think this is an interesting example of that. I think the wiki has accelerated that. I think the solution to that is to like bring back more warranting and do a bunch of other things. I have like a 7-step plan for how you can resist the simulacra. But I'll talk about that later, maybe. But yeah, strategic game autonomy, like what does this really mean? What are we actually getting at? I think that people are stringing together cards that say strategic autonomy and mean very different things. But I think the best response to all of this is just that there are very good turns for why cohesion actually decreases in the EU. Lots of EU members don't like this. And probably there's some concern about Eurofederalism, and so this causes cohesion to massively decrease. There's a climate pro. This wasn't disclosed. I actually don't know what this is, but it's there. It's out there. So apparently there's a climate change link. I'm skeptical of it, but it exists. Next is arms controls. The idea is that the EU gets more bargaining power as a result of the nuclear sharing agreement, that they might be kind of like leverage for more arms control bargains. I think probably Russia just is unlikely to agree to this, especially as a result of escalation. And then finally, there's this interesting argument that's like we should kill the NPT intentionally because it's blocking the TPNW. Most obvious response is that the same reason that you would kill the NPT is actually a greater reason you would kill the TPNW, which is the ban treaty, because it violates it even more. So I think that this is just dead in the water. The next argument is Sahel investment. I don't really know the link to this, but I think any war scenario probably kills investment. And then there's this defense industrial base that's like this actually improves the defense industry of France and probably other countries in the EU. I think there's an interesting response to this that's just like, well, I think the best response is probably the military industrial complex turn, which is like it might not actually be a good thing to improve the defense industrial base because it kind of leaves you beholden politically to actors that have an incentive to get you involved in conflicts. And that might be a bad thing. Plus, there's an argument that France likes to do everything on its own, and so it won't be willing to integrate defense industrial bases with other countries in the EU, which means that this might actually splinter defense industrial bases across the EU instead. Okay, con arguments. First one is Russia punishes this. I think the best response is that there are lots of other things that Russia will do anyway, and lots of other ways that escalation will increase anyway on our current trajectory. So maybe, if anything, this like replaces likely alternatives that would be even more escalatory. There's some different nuances of this. Like I've heard people say that the nukes will be stationed in the Baltics, and that will be the red line for an invasion. I just think that means the nukes will not be stationed in the Baltics. Like I don't know why that's the most likely implementation. It seems like a lot of these are kind of impact prevents the link scenarios. And again, strategic ambiguity not necessarily entailed by one side of the resolution or the other. It can continue being ambiguous with the pro side as well. Also, Ukraine is not going to join the EU, and Ukraine is not going to get a nuke, even if they do join the EU, even under the pro arrangement. I think this argument is dead. Next argument is withdrawal. So the idea is that either NATO or the US will withdraw in some way from their security role in the region if the EU steps up to the plate. I think the best response to this is a turn that says that actually this complements NATO and this brings the US back in. You could read uniqueness that the US is currently leaving, even if the NATO summit is temporarily reversing that. I think realistically, a lot of the spending targets will fail and the US will find other priorities. And so it is likely that in the long term, across the Trump administration, at least in the medium term, maybe, that the US continues withdrawing from the EU and from NATO, which is a bad thing that could be reversed by the resolution. One of the main reasons that the US is withdrawing is because they don't think that Europe is doing enough to sort of carry its own security and that it's free riding too much on the US security guarantees. One way to reverse that is by showing the US that you're doing more by doing a nuclear sharing agreement, which might cause the US to stick around for longer and do more. Um, there's some cyber defense stuff. I've written extensively in past videos about why the cyber impact scenario is not the best. And then there's some NATO cohesion with just a laundry list of different scenarios for why NATO collapse is bad. I don't think that NATO necessarily has to collapse with partial withdrawal of the US. So I'm not sure that the level of the link actually accesses the impact scenarios here. Next is Turkey exclusion. There's this argument that like Turkey will feel sad that it's excluded and it will do bad things, or it will like sort of bandwagon is the technical term. It will like go in and hedge its bets by joining with Russia when it thinks that the European Union or NATO is not really supporting it. Or it will do other things that Russia wants it to do, which will be bad. Um, I think this is an interesting argument, but I think that to some extent, I think it kind of relies on NATO withdrawal because if NATO doesn't withdraw, Turkey is very dependent on NATO in the status quo. And so I think even if Turkey is marginally annoyed by not being in the EU and sort of being cut off from this, I think that it probably is not annoyed enough to jeopardize its current security commitments by going and joining with Russia. And if anything, I think that there's an argument that's a turn on this that like they will hedge their bets more with Europe if Europe flexes more military might, because like then they see that Europe is doing more to counter Russia. And so at that point, it's like, why would you join Russia if it seems like Europe is countering them more? And therefore, maybe Europe is a better play there that will defend you against any threats. Next one is an NPT violation. So this is pretty straightforward. The agreement maybe violates the NPT and hurts the non-proliferation regime. I think the best response here is either that there will be more proliferation without the agreement and that there's not much proliferation with the agreement. There's lots of sort of interesting ways that this agreement can be spun such that it doesn't really violate the NPT, or at least that it doesn't violate the NPT any more than the original NATO nuclear sharing did. And so maybe it's not such a big deal. Um, there are also some interesting like NPT bad arguments worth exploring. EU cohesion is the next neg argument. Um, that maybe like the EU will splinter or collapse if this agreement happens. I think this is a bit unrealistic. I think that there will be some complaints in the EU, but I think number one, there's a little bit of fiat power working here that like all of the EU members sort of have to agree to this. And so the most likely implementation of this is one that is unlikely to really cause a ton of decreases in cohesion. Certainly not like a collapse of the EU, I would imagine. And then also, I think this relies a little bit on domestic politics arguments within each country. And I think there's actually good reason to suggest that this actually looks good for the EU, if anything, since a lot of countries' first priority these days, even if in the past it wasn't, is deterring Russia. And so it's important to take into account the timeline of events here, because a lot of the literature that people are going to be reading for link arguments on this comes from a few years back when the Ukraine-Russia scenario was not quite as aggressive as it is today. And so I think a lot of populations within EU countries have started to realize that they care more about preventing a Russian attack than they do about preventing the EU from gaining a lot of power. So those trade-offs are sort of okay and accepted by a lot of populations today. The next one is arsenal expansion. So this is just that the agreement will have to increase France's arsenal in order to be credible, and in order to establish an independent deterrent capability, I think is the more reasonable interpretation of the resolution. And there may be some bad things that go along with that. I've heard that this will cause a uranium shortage. I don't think this is the case because realistically, the expansion of the arsenal doesn't have to be that crazy, and There's so many stockpiles. I mean, France has a huge stockpile. France also has so much nuclear energy that they can, they can create so much plutonium. It's not even a problem for them. Also, uranium is just not that rare. It's just not that rare, like in the Earth. It's just not that rare. And there are so many military grade stockpiles in Europe that, I mean, people would probably just use those instead of digging for more. So it's probably not a great argument. Um, also, oh wait, also like arguably the uranium shortage might be good. I don't know. Maybe there's an impact turn there. And then there's another one about testing that says that if we build more of an arsenal, we have to test the nuclear weapons somewhere, and that will like be bad. There's a history of structural violence and terrible things there. Um, this is an interesting argument. I think that it's probably true that you have to test them a little bit. I think that most likely France will just use existing testing grounds, but there's a problem of like existing testing grounds being bad, right? Like Algeria. I think that there's defense that says that like the places where France has historically tested its nuclear weapons, it sort of learned from its mistakes, hopefully. And, those have been very controversial. And so that controversy will deter it from doing that, which means the impact solves the link to some extent. But then the question is like, where else is it going to test? Um, Fortunately, I think that this is relatively easy to answer because if you can find even one example of a place that would be okay to test, then that becomes the most likely implementation, most likely, across the EU. And so I think it's not that hard to do to find a relatively uncontroversial testing ground. Next is French politics. Also, testing is relatively non-unique. It is worth saying. French politics is another argument. It's like the far right specifically will gain power in France, or at least will just sort of try to block this as much as possible, which will create gridlock in French parliament. I think that there's actually a turn here that's interesting that says that like maybe this will actually look like a great, powerful leadership move by Macron. Um, and also, I think that this is relatively non-unique since there's a million other factors in French politics. And, Macron does things that make people mad all the time, especially the far-right parties. Plus, elections are far way away, and people don't really care that much in France about like nuclear weapon stuff. I don't think this will be a huge like tipping point. Dollar hegemony, don't know really know what this argument is, but it exists on the wiki. Same as like the climate argument as on the pro before, worth looking into maybe. Spending DA is uh, relatively straightforward. We have to spend a lot of money to do this, and that is bad. I think this is interesting because it could potentially link into like a populism argument as well, because military spending often drives populism. That said, problem with that argument and any spending DA is that the recent NATO summit saw countries, including France, especially France, committing to a 5% of GDP spending on their security and military budgets. That's a problem because that is definitely more than the nuclear arsenal would cost. People are going to have some crazy numbers for how much the nuclear arsenal would cost. I think realistically, it's not going to be that big of an expansion. And if you don't win that there's a nuclear arsenal expansion, which might not actually be a very likely form of implementation, I know that Macron has said that they're not looking to expand their arsenal, for example, then this argument probably goes away because the spending you would need to just base and like build the air, like, modify the air bases is very minimal. Next is the British Relations DA. I think that this is an interesting one. So this is like the UK will like no longer have agreements with the EU. I think that number one, it's a little bit confusing to me why the UK would care. Um, you know, Presumably it's because you're duplicating NATO and they don't like that. But most likely implementation supplements NATO and all the rhetoric around it will be very like we're not replacing NATO at all. Um, Plus, I think the UK incentives sort of align with this agreement to some extent, and like defending the rest of Europe and deterring Russia. And then finally, I think that even if the UK is annoyed about this, it's a far jump to go from like the UK doesn't want this to happen to like the UK will cancel all existing agreements with the EU. That seems like crazy. And they probably have no incentive to do that, and it would backfire against them if they did politically. So I think that's just very unlikely. And then finally, there's a defensive overview that I saw people reading. The deterrence, fails and takes too long. I think this is actually very promising. This is what Ryan Lafferty was talking about a bit in our interview. I think this is probably a true argument that it takes quite a long time, especially if you're expanding the arsenal. I do think an answer to this is like the initial agreement doesn't take a very long time, and the symbolic threat of the agreement is enough to establish a lot of the benefits because it's all symbolic all the way down anyway. And so as long as you're starting to do the agreement and sort of implementing it quickly, I think it's okay. Plus, the agreement could be implemented fully without arsenal expansion like tomorrow. I mean, probably not tomorrow, but like um, lots of different forms of the agreement don't take a very long time. And so it's likely to me that like the agreement takes a lot of different layered forms, and some of those forms get implemented immediately, and some of them you have to wait. But they all contribute to some extent to deterrence. And so I think that it's okay that some of them will take longer than others. Plus, like we're not like talking about a timeline where Russia invades tomorrow. Most of the intelligence reports have said like there's a chance Russia invades by 2029 or something. And so I think it's okay if it takes a little bit longer. Um, okay. There's also Spark. People are reading Spark. For those of you who don't know, this is we should intentionally trigger a nuclear war because this will sort of grind industrial society to a halt, which prevents the development of other worse weapons than nuclear weapons. Nuclear war is not that bad, and it can solve other things like climate change and other ills of modern industry. Um, I think that nuclear war is bad. There's a bunch of theory positions that people have broken as well. And so here's my like original analytic sketching of some prep outs of different arguments on both sides as I'm continuing to try to mine through the wiki and prep everything out. I will start actually cutting cards for all of these today, so look forward to that. But without further ado, let's play some GeoGuessr. We had a pretty good game last time, so hoping to continue the momentum. Let's see. Okay, this should be 5Kable. This is South Africa to begin with. R38, Carolina and Bethel. I know that they're numbered or organized relatively. What does this look like, first of all? Um, to me, this looks more like Eastern, to be honest. Um, but I don't know. Let's see if we can find the R38 real quick. I mean, are there any crops that I can use? Well, no, I was going to say that might be a tree plantation. I don't think it is a tree plantation. So let's look. R38, where would the R38 be? R23, R50, R39, that's pretty close. R35, for, I mean, they're kind of scattered, I think. Oh, there it is. Oh, there's Carolina. Great. And then where are we going? So Carolina, and then over here we have Bethel. Bethel and Carolina. Where's Bethel? There's Bethel. What's the angle? The angle is here. Can we find the other place? It's smaller for sure, but can we find it? I bet we can. What is it called? L I'm not going to try to pronounce that. Lelefontein or something. It's that way. Okay, let's see. So maybe, is it up here somewhere? Wait, no, I don't know. What's the angle though? Does this road curve? It does curve. Okay, it's curving that way. So maybe we're like here. Could that be? I think it could be. Nope, it doesn't have two branch points. So let's try again. The curve was nice though. Is there another one? No, 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 no. Um, hmm, hmm. Are we? I thought we were east of Hendrina with the angle. Surely we're east of Hendrina. So then where is this? Is it actually just here? I mean, what's happening with this? Because this angle fits pretty well. I mean, it wouldn't be, yeah, it's not over here, right? It's also like the angle of the street coming out needs to be considered. which does kind of look like that. Like, what is, I just am confused about the weird double road on the map. Um, I wish we could find the name, but I think it's like the La Live Fontaine or whatever. I think it's too small. Um, could it be over here? I mean, it's not going to be this, right? Like this is wrong angle and it's way too small. So I think we might be on the 5K. I think we might. This is a risk, but I think we might have it. Hmm. Let's just really quick check the Bethel roads because that's the only risk, I think. Um, yeah, I'm not really seeing it. I mean, unless it's this, but this angle doesn't fit. So I think we can confidently say we're on it. I think so. Yes. Okay. Great. Good 5K. Happy with that. Next. Okay. North. Um, this is a harder round. This is not going to be a 5K. Sorry. What are we looking at here? What is this? Uh-oh. Uh-oh. I mean, it kind of looks like Greece. I don't know if that's a crazy thing to say. Um, Greece or like Bulgaria could be a shout. I might go Greece. I mean, this is like head empty guess. I've got no clue for what this might be. Actually, let's just look for a second. Could this actually be like Montenegro or something? I can't be bothered. I can't be bothered. It was Spain. No. Well, at least we got the Mediterranean vibe. That's a hard Spain to get. Okay, this looks like it's going to be Quebec, right? Wait. Actually, I don't know. Do I know? I might know. This might be one of those. This might be New Brunswick. Um, we have front plates. That's suspicious. That's really suspicious. It could actually even be Ontario, like French-speaking Ontario. What are we looking at here? This looks vaguely Ontario. Um, hmm. Are there any polls that I could use? No. I mean, I feel like, do I really send anything other than Quebec here with the French? Well, this says all north. I mean, you would expect it to be like very French in Quebec. So then the question is, do you go New Brunswick or Ontario? I mean, New Brunswick would have fewer front plates, given that they changed, but this looks like old coverage, so maybe they would have more front plates back then. Um, what does it look like? This is suspicious, deeply suspicious. I feel like it would be foolish to send anything far from Quebec. Like I know that there's the one place, I don't know, there's like pockets of French. There's like Sudbury that has some French in Ontario. I think there's even some stuff over on like the Manitoba border. But don't you just send like Ottawa or something? I mean, the grid doesn't really, I don't know that we can trust the grid anyway. Um, but I don't know. Like, I feel like with the signage, ooh, this is going to be bad. Do you go New Brunswick? Do you ever go New Brunswick? Maybe you do. Maybe you do. Maybe you go New Brunswick. This is gonna hurt me. This is gonna hurt me. Oh my gosh. It was the weird pocket. It was the weird Ontario pocket of French. Okay, that's okay. We vibe because now we're in Japan. And I like Japan. I love Japan. Japan is great, especially when I can see a pole. Um, that said, what is this pole? What is this transformer configuration? It is a little bit weird. I would love to have seen some pole plates, but I guess It's asking for too much. Um, I thought, okay, I don't want to say anything and be like absolutely wrong. So let me just take a moment to really consider this. Okay, moment taken. I think this is Kanto or Tohoku, I thought. There's like a slight risk of Hokkaido, but I don't really think it is, right? I don't think that's the transformer configuration you would get in Hokkaido. Um, but I've said it, so if it is, then I get to claim that I was right in thinking about it. I think, I mean, the hills look weird for Tohoku, but I think I might go Tohoku here. Um, I guess I've just forgotten this transformer configuration, unfortunately. So let's do some hedging. Fukushima hedge ever? Okay, it was Chugoku. That's not what I remember the Chugoku transformer configuration looking like, but that is okay. Yeah, we have some good games, we have some bad games. Let's end on a good guess. This is Italy. I know Italy when I see it, and this is it. It's right here in front of us. Um, I can't read, but that is okay because we have some landscape clues. Rolling hills. I mean, you gotta think this looks a little bit more north, right? Arguably, north or central. Mobili d'arte. Yeah, I'm gonna go like Florence. Okay, not the worst. Not the worst. It was pretty central. That's like the northern half of the country, so we're good. Okay, not the best game. Not the best game. I'll admit it. We did get a 5K, which was nice. Can't always win them all, but I hope that was entertaining, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye bye.